Hello and welcome back to The Last Climb. In today's episode, I'm talking about an influencer who fired the one person responsible for getting her off the mountain safely because the pictures weren't turning out the way she wanted. That left her summit attempt in the hands of the porter, who had never guided a summit before. She'd eventually find herself stopping every few steps just to catch her breath as fluid slowly filled her lungs. It was November 17th, 2022. Aconcagua rises in Mendoza province, Argentina, near the Chilean border, reaching 22,838 feet above sea level, making it the highest peak in both the western and southern hemispheres. The mountain sits deep in the Andes, surrounded by glaciers, loose scree, and snow-covered ridgelines. And I want to emphasize that the southern hemisphere climbing season had only just begun. November is the earliest and most unpredictable part of the season. Most experienced climbers wait until December or January, when the weather is generally more stable. Those who head up in the first weeks of November are taking on a lot more uncertainty, whether they realize it or not. Megan West was 28 years old, from Nashville, Tennessee. She ran a travel and outdoor Instagram account built around carefully curated landscapes, golden light, and magazine-worthy compositions. By 2022, she had a handful of brand partnerships with outdoor companies, enough to help fund trips as long as she kept producing content that performed. In the months before the trip, she had been running regularly, doing weighted hikes, and reading everything she could about Aconcagua's normal route. Commercial operators often market it as a climb that's achievable for fit, non-technical hikers, and she believed them. Honestly, a lot of people would. The problem wasn't her fitness. It was altitude experience, and those aren't the same thing. Megan had hiked in Iceland, the Dolomites, and climbed a Colorado 14er the previous summer. The highest she'd ever been was around 14,000 feet. She had no idea how her body would respond above 18,000, and that's not something you can simulate on a trail in Tennessee. I would have liked a little more evidence before betting on my lungs, but that's just me. All the while, she had also been posting about the trip for weeks before she left, packing videos, gear posts, training updates. Her audience knew she was going, and by the time she landed in Mendoza, turning back probably felt like more than a personal decision. It was a content decision too. Then there was the image. As all of this was coming together, Megan found a photo online taken from Aconcagua's upper ridge at golden hour. The snow glowed warm beneath a deep orange and pink sky, and she'd been determined to recreate it ever since. That photo was the reason she chose this mountain. Everything else, the climb, the altitude, the weeks of acclimatization, was simply what it took to reach that moment. I don't know, risking your life because a photo looked cool online is one of the wildest sentences I've ever had to say. She brought a Sony mirrorless camera, a small flexible tripod, and a compact gimbal camera. The Sony was her main camera, expensive and capable, but complicated enough that handing it to someone unfamiliar with it was never going to be easy. Now, before we get into the climb itself, let me give you some context about what Aconcagua actually demands from the people who attempt it. The normal route gains over 9,000 feet from base camp to summit. The full expedition typically takes between 16 and 21 days, and a big chunk of that time isn't spent climbing. It's spent acclimatizing. You climb high, you come back down, you rest, you go higher. You repeat that process until your body has had enough time to adjust to the reduced oxygen at each elevation. Above 13,000 feet, your body is already working harder than normal. Above 18,000 feet, your appetite drops. Sleep becomes difficult, and your ability to recover slows down significantly. Above 20,000 feet, the margin for error gets very narrow, very fast. One of the biggest misconceptions about acclimatization is that you can speed it up. You can't. It happens during rest, not movement. Cutting your rotation short doesn't save time. It just shifts the risk higher up the mountain, where the consequences are much harder to deal with. And because this was still early in the climbing season, the weather added another layer. Systems can move in faster than forecast at this time of year. Teams that push summit attempts in the first weeks of the season have less room to absorb delays than those who wait for the more stable mid-season window. That detail is going to matter later. Megan's guide was 53 years old. He had been leading climbs on Aconcagua for over 20 years and had summited the peak more times than he kept count of anymore. He was not a loud man. He explained things once, clearly, and trusted you to remember. He had a daughter back home, roughly Megan's age, who loved photography. He had carried her camera equipment on day hikes more than once. He knew what it looked like when someone genuinely cared about getting a shot right. That puts a lot into perspective, because it probably explains why he was as patient as he was with Megan for as long as he was. He recognized something in her that reminded him of someone he loved, and that made him extend more grace than the situation probably called for. He had also seen enough clients over 20 years to know the difference between someone who was prepared and someone who believed they were. He noticed the difference with Megan early on. He didn't say anything about it. He just filed it away. The first sign that this was going to be a different kind of guiding job came on the approach to base camp. Megan stopped frequently to set up shots. The flexible tripod she had brought was nearly useless on uneven rocky ground, and after 2 failed attempts to stabilize it, she handed the Sony to her guide and showed him what to press. He held it carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else. He took the shots she asked for. She reviewed them, asked him to move slightly to the left. He did. She said they were good. He handed the camera back, and they kept moving. At base camp, she spent part of the first afternoon arranging her gear on her sleeping bag and photographing it. He watched without comment. She asked him to hold a trekking pole at a specific angle while she framed a shot around it. He stood there for several minutes while she adjusted her composition. When she was done, she thanked him, and he nodded. Now look, none of this is outrageous on its own. Plenty of people bring cameras on expeditions. The issue was the pattern that was starting to form and where that pattern was going to lead. The first real friction came during the initial acclimatization rotation toward Camp 1. Megan wanted to stop at a ridgeline with a clear view west for a walking shot. Her moving toward the camera with the mountain behind her, she explained what she wanted. He set up the Sony where she indicated, pressed record, and she walked the path. She reviewed the footage and said the horizon was tilted. He adjusted. She walked it again. She said it was better, but he had started recording too late and missed her entry into frame. He adjusted again. She walked it a 4th time. He checked his watch once, but said nothing. Megan noticed and told him she just needed one more take, and he nodded without protest. The second friction point came at Camp 1 during a scheduled rest day. Megan asked if they could push the following morning's departure back by an hour because the early light was better for filming. He explained that the departure time was set around temperature and wind patterns higher on the mountain, not light quality. She said she understood but asked if there was any flexibility. He said there wasn't. She accepted it and went back to her tent. That evening she recorded a voice memo. She said he was good at his job but that he didn't seem to understand what she was trying to accomplish. She said she was going to need to be more direct about her needs going forward. Now here's where the Sony starts becoming its own problem. The first significant mistake happened during the rotation to Camp 2. She handed him the camera in photo mode, and while adjusting his grip, he accidentally touched the screen and shifted the focus setting without realizing it. She didn't notice until she reviewed the images that evening and found them all slightly soft. She went quiet for a moment, then said it was probably her fault for not explaining the settings clearly enough. She showed him the focus menu and walked him through it. He listened carefully and asked her to show him once more. She did. Give him credit for that. He was trying. There's something kind of endearing about how seriously he took a camera that wasn't even his. The second mistake happened a couple of days later. She had been using the camera in video mode for a walking shot and handed it to him without switching it back to photo. He shot about 40 seconds of video thinking he was taking stills. She reviewed what she thought were photos and found a shaky clip of her adjusting her jacket. She exhaled slowly and took the camera back without saying much. The third time, she sat with him for several minutes before handing it over. She went through each setting deliberately. Focus mode, shutter speed, the button to half press before shooting. He repeated each step back to her. He got the shots right. She looked through them and told him those were actually really good. He said she had a good eye for where to stand. It was the easiest the two of them had been with each other since the trip started. And there was one afternoon during a rest day between rotations when Megan wasn't filming at all. She sat outside her tent with something warm to drink and just looked out at the mountain. Her guide was sitting nearby, doing the same. She asked him how many times he'd reached the summit, he told her. Then she asked what it had felt like the first time. He thought about it for a moment before answering. He didn't talk about the view or the accomplishment. He talked about the quiet. How, for a few minutes, the wind seemed to disappear and everything around him went completely still. Megan just listened. She never once reached for her camera. He noticed that. It was the only conversation they had that had nothing to do with the climb or the content. And I think if things had gone differently, that moment could have been the turning point where the dynamic between them finally started to shift, but it wasn't enough to change the trajectory of what was coming. Above Camp 2, the cold became harder on his hands. He had switched to thicker gloves, which made the small buttons on the Sony difficult to operate precisely. She noticed him fumbling once, and took the camera back to adjust a setting herself before returning it. She did it quickly and without making it a moment. He appreciated that. But the patience on both sides was running thinner than either of them was showing. The argument that changed everything happened 2 days before the planned summit attempt. The afternoon light at high camp was exceptional, the kind that only exists at altitude when the air is thin and the sun is dropping. Megan had been planning this shot since before she left Nashville. She had the reference image saved on her phone. She had shown it to her guide on the very first day of the trip. He looked at the photo for a few seconds and gave a small nod. Now, 2 weeks later, she was finally in a position to get it. They reached the ridge she had identified at 5:43 in the afternoon. The light was already shifting, but still there. Still warm, still the quality she had come for. She positioned herself and told him where to stand, how low to get, what she wanted in the frame. He got down on one knee and raised the Sony. At this point, I was practically begging the mountain to let them get the photo and just move on. But Megan kept chasing the version she had in her head. The first image came out with the horizon slightly tilted, so she asked him to adjust. The second was better, but her face had fallen into shadow because of where she was standing. She moved a few feet to the right. The third had the lighting she wanted, but the framing was too tight. She asked for more sky above her, and he stepped back. The fourth included more sky, but now the foreground rocks were too distracting. She asked him to move left. He did. His gloved fingers found the shutter button, and he took several more frames. She reviewed them in the fading light. The warmth was gone. The sky was still colorful, pinks and deep blues, but the specific golden quality on her face, the thing she had described to him, the thing she had built the entire trip around, was no longer there. The light had moved while they were adjusting the composition. She stood very still for a moment looking at the screen. Then she told him that the whole point of coming up to the ridge early was to have enough time to get the shot before the light changed, that if he had gotten the angle right the first time, they would have had it, that she had explained exactly what she wanted and they had spent the whole window making small adjustments instead of shooting. He told her he had positioned himself where she asked. He told her he had adjusted every time she asked him to adjust. He told her the light moved because light moves, and that spending that much time repositioning on a shot that required the light to be in a specific place was always going to be a risk. She told him she had been patient with him the entire trip, that she had re-explained the camera settings multiple times, that she had worked around his pace and his schedule and his timeline, and that this one thing, this one shot, was what the trip was for. He reminded her that the summit was why they were there. The photograph wasn't. She fired him that evening. Whoa. Firing the one person whose job was to keep her safe after he'd spent 2 weeks doing everything he could to help her? That's honestly kind of messed up. I saw a comment from user at Riddler7676 that said, "Why would you not trust the people that know what they are doing? Just sad." Which is true, because expertise isn't there to ruin the adventure. It's there to make sure you get to have another one. She went on to tell him she would pay him through the end of the contracted days, but that she no longer wanted him on the climb. He told her she should not continue without a qualified guide. She told him she had the porter, who had been with them since base camp and knew the route. She contacted the commercial operator that night. They strongly advised against continuing without a licensed guide. They noted the weather window. They documented that she had been warned and that the decision to proceed was hers. They could not physically stop her. The porter didn't officially replace the guide, he just didn't leave. He stayed because he felt responsible for her and because no one with authority was there to stop the situation. He was 24 years old and on only his third expedition on this mountain. He had never guided a summit attempt. The guide spoke to him privately before descending. He told him the weather window was narrowing. A system was forecast to arrive within 30 to 36 hours of their planned departure from high camp. He told him Megan had been moving slower than expected on the last rotation and that her appetite had been poor for 2 days. He told him to watch her breathing and to turn back immediately if anything changed. The porter nodded and said he understood. Before leaving, the guide set a pair of chemical hand warmers outside the porter's tent. He didn't knock or leave a note. He just left them there. He also left the radio, placed just inside the tent flap where the porter would see it. Then he shouldered his pack and started down the mountain. On his way down, he passed a team ascending from the camp below. One of the climbers recognized him and asked if everything was all right. He said his client had decided to continue without him. The other climber watched him go. I've always respected that about him. Even after she fired him, he never really stopped looking out for her. Hats off to guides like him. The summit attempt began at 11:10 that night. Conditions were cold and clear. Megan moved well in the first 2 hours. Focused, quiet, a different version of herself than the one who had been stopping every hour for content. The porter stayed close. The mountain was dark, and their headlamps made small circles of light on the snow ahead of them. A little after 2 in the morning, Megan coughed. Then she coughed again. She pulled her buff over her face and kept climbing. The porter noticed, but at that point it didn't seem unusual. By 4, it was happening often enough that he couldn't ignore it. Every few minutes she'd clear her throat, catch her breath, and continue. She was still moving at a decent pace, so he convinced himself it wasn't anything serious. They stopped for a short break at around 20,000 feet. Megan pulled out her gimbal camera and filmed the pre-dawn sky. Her breath drifted into the beam of her headlamp as she talked about how quiet it was. Listening back, her voice still sounded completely normal. As they climbed higher, the cough started to sound different. It wasn't as dry anymore. There was a wetness to it that neither of them understood for what it was. The porter had never dealt with anything like this before. He heard the difference, registered that something had shifted, but Megan was already moving again, and he didn't have the experience or the authority to stop her over a cough, so they kept going. They reached the summit at 8:47 that morning. Megan stood there for a few seconds, taking it all in. Then she reached for the Sony. She was breathing harder than the climb alone explained, stopping between shots to cough and recover. She handed the camera to the porter and showed him the button. He held it the way her guide had, carefully, with both hands. He took the shots she asked for. She reviewed them and asked him to adjust the angle. He adjusted. She coughed into her sleeve, straightened up, and asked for a few more. What really gets me is this. She fired her guide 2 days earlier, partly over the way he held that same camera. Now she was handing it to someone with even less experience, coughing between frames, and still directing the shot. She spent 29 minutes at the summit. The wind picked up at 9:18. The porter looked west. The sky had changed. A flat gray quality moving in from the horizon that he recognized from what the guide had described to him. He told her they needed to go. She asked for 5 more minutes. He said they needed to go now. She took the camera from him and shot 3 more frames herself, holding it at arm's length. The descent began at 9:25. Over the next hour, the wind continued to build and the cold took on a different edge, sharper somehow. Megan's pace slowed and the coughing became impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, she'd stop, bend forward, catch her breath, and force herself to keep going. The porter never let her get more than an arm's length away. At some point, he realized he'd stopped watching the trail ahead and was only watching her. Something about the way she was moving didn't look right. Every time she stopped, it took a little longer before she straightened up again. At around 21,000 feet, she finally sat down. She told him she just needed a minute. He waited, but when she tried to stand again, her legs wouldn't cooperate. She sank back into the snow. Even over the wind, he could hear her breathing. It was wet, labored, and unlike anything he'd heard before. At 11:04 that morning, he called for help over the radio. The response was immediate. The weather had deteriorated too much for rescuers to safely reach them. They were told to shelter in place and wait for a break in the storm. He set up the emergency bivvy, got her inside, and gave her the single emergency oxygen bottle the guide had left behind after warning them not to continue without proper support. She was still conscious and still talking, but every sentence was shorter than the last. Between words, she kept stopping to cough. She insisted she only needed to rest and would be able to keep moving. He told her help was coming. Their oxygen ran out after the first 90 minutes. After that, all they could do was wait. It was just the 2 of them inside the bivvy, the wind pressing against the fabric, nothing left to do but wait. He kept talking to her. At some point, she stopped responding. The weather didn't break for 6 hours. By the time rescuers were finally able to reach them, more than 5.5 hours had passed. They found Megan unresponsive inside the bivvy. The porter was still alive, but severely hypothermic. It was already dark by then. Megan West died the following day after rescuers brought her down the mountain, and she was later transferred to a hospital in the city of Mendoza. The coroner's findings identified 2 causes of death that were working together. The primary cause was high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, a condition where fluid builds up in the lungs and gradually prevents the body from getting enough oxygen. The findings were consistent with HAPE that had likely been developing before the summit push based on the cough, loss of appetite, and worsening breathing described by the guide and porter. The second cause was hypothermia. hypothermia, brought on by prolonged exposure at extreme altitude after her body had already been severely compromised. The two conditions fed into each other as the pulmonary edema made it harder for her body to absorb oxygen and regulate its temperature. The cold accelerated the progression of the edema. The report also listed several contributing factors: continuing the summit attempt without a licensed guide, failing to recognize or report the early respiratory symptoms, spending longer at the summit than conditions allowed, and continuing without the level of emergency support normally available on a guided expedition. The porter recovered from hypothermia and was released from medical care 4 days later. Investigators were also able to reconstruct the timeline in remarkable detail. The Sony camera still contained time-stamped images from the summit taken between 8:47 and 9:23 that morning. GPS data confirmed both the ascent and the descent. The porter's radio logs matched the timeline. Her phone also contained a voice memo recorded at Camp 1, in which she said her guide didn't understand what she was trying to accomplish and that she needed to be more direct about her needs going forward. The guide's written report, filed with the commercial operator before he descended from high camp, documented the approaching weather system, his recommendation not to continue, and the fatigue and loss of appetite he'd noticed in Megan during the previous 2 days. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same sequence of events. The golden hour photos from the ridge were still on the Sony. The warm light she'd been chasing was already gone. The sky behind her was still beautiful, but her face sat half in shadow. It wasn't the image she'd saved on her phone. It wasn't the photograph she'd shown her guide on the first day. And it wasn't the shot she'd come all that way to recreate. The last post on Megan's account had been uploaded the evening before the summit attempt. It showed her standing at high camp with the mountain behind her. The sky was clear, and she looked calm and confident. The caption talked about trusting the process. By the time rescuers reached her on the mountain, the post had already been seen by thousands of people. She came close, just not close enough.